Recording here. So the plan is kind of look at this a little bit bigger picture. Uh, we've got a couple more parts to the narrative example from John 4. We want to look at the character analysis and then do the plot analysis. And then once we've done that, we'll talk a little bit about, how putting the message together for John 4 from that study. And then after that, if you guys still want to continue, we can start looking at the poetry genre and just start learning about the poetic part of the Bible, which is substantial. There's a number of books of the Bible that use poetry, particularly Hebrew poetry. But we even find it in the New Testament. There's many examples of poetry, even Hebrew poetry elements. So the plan was, Lord willing, within a few weeks, as we wrap up, just looking at John 4 as an example of narrative, I'll start looking at going through poetry with you guys, and that'll be fun. It'll be something different. So
yeah, that'll be great, Pastor Tim. That'll be great to look at the poetry. I was just going to look at this. This is quite funny, how especially in the wisdom literature, the Hebrews way of writing. He says, for example, in Proverbs 30, it says that under 3 things the earth tremble, under 4 it cannot bear out. So the question is it 4 things or is it 3 things? Because when you read it, he's talking about 3. This is the way they expressed it. I think that'll be interesting to do the wisdom literature.
Yeah, there's definitely some things to keep in mind when you approach poetry, with the figurative language and things like that I think sometimes gets misunderstood by interpreters when they study and preach from those portions. So we'll definitely tackle that, look at how to study and preach a psalm, because those are, of course, a special class, but they're not the only, Psalms is not the only book with poetry in it. There's a number of other books. You mentioned the Proverbs. It's full of poetry, and Ecclesiastes, Job, most of all the prophets, most of them use poetry. So it's very, very common. I think, if I remember right, it's like 25% of the Bible, at least 20% of the Bible is poetic in nature. So it's a substantial amount. But what's interesting to me as I study poetry is I see those elements used, like in the epistles in particular. There are many poetic features in the epistles that I didn't notice as much before until I actually took a class on Psalms. And then when I was studying some of the epistles, especially Paul, he tends to use poetic elements in his letters. So anyway, that's just down the road. Hopefully within a few weeks we can start working on that if you guys want to continue. But plan here should be able to meet for a few weeks together. I'm in town here, and so we'll keep working on John. Today our focus is on the character analysis. And last time we met, we just sort of reviewed the steps for character analysis, which is the third step in narrative analysis. So we've done the setting, we've done the scenes. Now we're looking at the characters. And then last time we gathered, we reviewed the procedure for how do we do character analysis in the story. And again, remember the difference is at this point, what we're doing is, the setting is the first thing we did, because we want to first understand the general background of the story, right? Where did it happen? When did it happen? Who's in the story? What culture's involved? Those are the kind of things. So that gives us sort of the setting of the story. And then the next step, we get more focused, where we break down the story into its scenes and then look at each scene. So that's a more narrow view of looking at the parts of the story, using the basic building blocks, which are scenes. And then now in character analysis, we go a step back again. And this time we look at the story more as a whole and focusing now on, okay, what are the main characters for the whole story? And then the next one is plot, which is also looking at the story as a whole and asking, okay, what's the message of this story and how do we see that message brought? So the setting, the scenes, the character, those analyses all are meant to build up our understanding of the story so that we can then um, figure out, understand the plot. Okay, because the plot is what leads us to the message of the story. But it's really more difficult to see the plot unless you do these other steps to examine, like I said, the setting, the scenes, and here the characters. So for the characters, we're looking at the story more as a whole. So I want you to think more that way. And so in this procedure, doing the character analysis, the first step is again to read through the story several times, as we discussed last time. And yes, we've already done that when we started narrative analysis. The first thing we did for setting was read through the story several times. But I like to do this again at this step because we've now already done some work on the story. We've done the setting, we've done the scenes. And I like to then come back to, okay, let me read through a few more times. And usually I'll do it in other translations because I may gain other insights that weren't obvious to me the first time I read through. So this is just, again, trying to reinforce the really the art and practice of reading and paying attention when we read. There's so much that in Bible study that comes from the ability to read well and to read actively. And so that's the point here is to just do that once more. Once we've done that and then make observations, you just write things down that catch our attention. Maybe things we hadn't noticed before, or maybe now we see certain things with more clarity, or maybe now more questions have come up. But make observations of the as you reread. And then next is to identify and categorize each character. We spent some time on that in the last session. You can go back to that video for that. But we identified the protagonist, who's the main character. The antagonist opposes the protagonist. So anti is against. The antagonist is he opposes, either creates or increases the problem in the story. And we discussed last time the importance of recognizing, okay, what is the problem in the story? That really drives the whole story. Once the problem's identified, then you're looking at how does that problem get fixed or resolved or end? And so that's the key. And then the problem as well can help show us who the antagonist is in the story. Who is it that causes the problem or perhaps makes a problem worse? All right. Then we have the foils. They are another main characters in the story. They are given in the story by the author to compare or contrast with the main characters, meaning the protagonist or antagonist, or sometimes other foils they're contrasted to. But these are important characters in the story. They're not the main characters. The main characters are the protagonist and the antagonist, but the foils are important characters that highlight something about the main characters, either by way of comparing with them or contrasting. You'll often see that in stories where another character comes along that sometimes shows us what the protagonist should or shouldn't be doing, or contrasts with the antagonist, or in some way highlights a feature of the antagonist. So they are important. Now, not every character that we see in a story is significant to the story. There are many, like in movies, they call them extras, in the motion pictures and movies. They're just people who are in the story, maybe they might even have some dialogue or some action, but they're not significant or key to the story. They're just there to carry the story along, right? So, like for example, if the story's about a sporting event, and like I don't know if you've seen the movie Gladiator, or this big sporting event, they come in to fight. Now, what if they came in and there's nobody in the stadium, right? That would not make the story realistic, would it? It's like, well, wait a minute. No, there were crowds when these people fought. So all the people in the stadium are not key characters, but they're necessary and important to help carry the story. Um, or, if you have a story where someone's needs to go to, get a ride to, on the taxi to go somewhere. So you'll have a taxi cab driver, and maybe the taxi cab driver might even say a couple of things in the story, but that doesn't mean he's critical to the story. Now, he could be. The author may throw him in and have him say something that's significant, but normally he's just an extra. He's just somebody there. Somebody has to be driving the taxi, right? So if the main character got in the taxi and no one's driving it, and all of a sudden the taxi takes off, you would go, "This is strange." So again, not every character is going to be a main character, though. In a scene, for example, in the taxi cab scene, if the main character gets in the taxi and he goes somewhere and he has a discussion with the taxi cab driver, now in that scene, the taxi driver could be a key character just as to carry the scene, but that doesn't mean he's one of the main characters in the story, that he's a foil in the story. Now he could be, but I'm just telling you, he doesn't have to be. So sometimes people get confused, or they think that every character in the story has some significance to the point of the story, and every character we see in a story is like a main character, but that's not always the case, right? So just keeping that in mind. So again, we've got the key characters, the main characters of the whole story are going to be the protagonist, the antagonist, and then some of the characters may function as a foil to compare, contrast with the main characters. All right. And then finally, we have the narrator, who I call a character in the story. He's not in the actual story. He's the one that tells the story. So in that sense, he's not like a character that's involved in the story, but he is a key person because he's the storyteller. So he's going to give us key details about certain events, maybe even tells us the thoughts, the motives, the actions of the characters, to give us insight into his message. Because again, we want to pay very close attention to the narrator. I put heavy emphasis on the narrator because he's the guide. He's the one guiding the reader to pay attention to certain features in the story. And so he's the one, right? Since he's the author, narrator is, we want to pay attention when he speaks. We want to pay attention when he inserts his thoughts or comments, because he's the guy that's writing the story. So he knows the message of the story, and he's going to tell us things that help us understand that message. So, and of course, he'll tell a lot, to help us understand the setting, the background, the scene, what's going on. Of course, he'll fill that in as well, but pay attention to the narrator. He's very important. And then, of course, finally, the central character in every story, really is the Lord himself. The Bible is focused on revealing to us who God is and what he has done and what he requires from us. And so we don't want to forget God as a central character in all of Scripture. Now, in a particular story, he may be the protagonist, or sometimes he's the antagonist. That is, he he causes or creates a problem in the story, at least from the character's point of view. One example of this might be the book of Ruth, where Naomi, right? She loses her husband, loses her sons. She is now left with this one Gentile widow who's with her, right? She comes back to Jerusalem and says, the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. Call me Mara. So in that story, the Lord appears to be an antagonist. He's bringing problems in this woman's life. So, so God can serve as the protagonist, like he is in Jonah, where he's trying to show his compassion on the lost, and Jonah is the antagonist. He's trying to thwart that. But in Ruth, it can be seen the other way around. Naomi as the main character, the protagonist. The story begins and ends with her, and God, seemingly like the antagonist, is bringing these problems. Of course, we know it's ultimately how he shows his care for her, care for Israel, and ultimately care for all of the world in sending a Redeemer. Um, so an antagonist doesn't always have to be a bad guy, and the protagonist is not always a good guy. It's just the main character upon whom a problem is caused or created by another character. Okay? So again, think of this in terms of, how stories are. I think I mentioned to you even before, I can't remember a movie I was watching about a cowboy. I don't know if I told you guys this. And he, in the movie, he shows up to help these kids. I think they were kids who had a problem. Like there was some bad guy trying to take their land. And so this former cowboy shows up. He's a farmer, and he helps these kids with this bad guy. Well, what happens? So he seems like the main guy, the good guy. But what happens over the course of the story is we realize this cowboy used to be the worst outlaw, a terrible criminal, and he had committed many horrible crimes. And that's sort of the author of the movies kind of twist it. So you think you're rooting for this guy. He's a good guy. He's helping, and all of a sudden, what? This guy is evil. And so the author did a trick. He so sometimes you'll see that where a main character protagonist may actually turn out to be the antagonist, or a protagonist turns out to be a bad guy, not a good guy. But generally speaking, most stories in scripture, the protagonist is sort of the hero of the story, and the antagonist is the villain of the story. That's most common. Okay, so again, that's just sort of reviewing where we were last week. So the second step is identifying those characters. Then the third step is now filling in the details. And this is the key part of this analysis is, okay, now that we know who those main characters are, what are the key statements that they make and the key actions that they perform? So for each character, so for the protagonist, you just look through the whole story and identify, okay, now that I've looked at the whole story, I've done the setting and the scenes, I've read it several times, what seem to be important statements made by this character? What seems to be important actions done by this character? And then is there anything else about that character that seems to be important? All right. So, and then there's a special category with the narrator. So identify the key statements and actions by the protagonist, by the antagonist, by the foils, and then what seem to be important statements by the narrator for the story as a whole. Again, now I'm looking at the story in its entirety and asking, okay, as I look through the whole story, what are comments made by the narrator that now seem significant to the story, to understanding the story? So that's the third step. And then finally, really, is identify God's role in the story and what do we learn about him from the story. This is especially important in the Old Testament, where God is often put to the side by interpreters and the focus is on the human characters in the story while neglecting what God is doing. So we want to make sure we don't do that, that we always recognize and understand what's God's role in this particular story. What do we learn about him? What does he show of himself from that? Okay. All right. So that's again just sort of overview of the character analysis. Do there any comments or questions before we look at John 4? Do the character analysis for John 4? Okay. I know again that's a review, and we did review last week, but it's important to understand what the purpose or what we're after in doing this particular step of character analysis. So what I'd like to have us do now is let's read through the story again. This time I chose the NIV. What I typically will do in this first step is I'll read through the story in different translations. We've been using the Legacy Standard Bible for the most part. So I thought today we would just read through the NIV, and there might be certain ways that the NIV translated something that catches our attention that maybe the other translations treat a little different. So that's why I do it. Sometimes I notice things that are different because it's worded differently, or a way something's translated might be a little different. So if you guys can help out here in our reading, that would be great. Let me ask Shulong if you could start us off and read the first 6 verses here, and then Yu Chai verses 7 through 12. Dwayne, if you could do verses 13 to 18. Daniel 19 to 24. Junsheng, if you could do verses 25 to 30. And then Philip 31 to 36. Tungin, if you could finish the story for us, verses 37 to 42. Okay?
Pastor Tim, I'm driving.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I don't want you to get in an accident, so I'll read your section. No problem. Okay.
Okay.
Shilong, want to
Let's
start us?
start it. Okay, John 4, 1 to 6. The Pharisees heard that Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John. Although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. When the Lord learned of this, he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about the 6th hour.
Verse 7, when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For the Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his flocks and herds?"
Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whosoever drinks the water that I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up into eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I don't get thirsty again and have to keep coming back here to draw water." He told her, "Go call your husband, come back." And she said, "I have no husband." Jesus said unto her, you are right. You said, when you said you have no husband, and the fact says you have had 5 husbands, and the man now you have is not even your husband. What you have just said is quite right.
Sir, the woman said, I can see that you're a prophet. Our fathers worship on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. Jesus declared, Believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in spirit and in truth.
Oh, I think this is my section. The woman said, I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. Then Jesus declared, I who speak to you am he. Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asked, what do you want? Or why are you talking with her? Then, leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Christ? They came out of the town and made their way toward him.
31 to 36.
Yes, sir.
Meanwhile, his disciples asked him, Rabbi, eat something. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you know nothing about. Then his disciples said to each other, could someone have brought him food? My food, said Jesus, is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Do you not say, 4 months more and then the harvest? I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields. They are ripe for the harvest. Even now the reaper draws his wages. Even now the harvest, the crop for eternal life, so that the sower and the reaper may be glad together.
37 to 42. Thus the saying one sows and another reaps is true. I sent you to reap what you have not worked for. Others have done the hard work, and you have reaped the benefits of their labor. Many of the Samaritans from their town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed 2 days. And because of his works, many more became believers. They said to the woman, we no longer believe just because of what you have said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world.
All right. So, what I like to do at this point, and maybe we'll just take a couple minutes. Normally I would take, 20 or 30 minutes and do additional observations of the story. But if you guys, here, I'll put I know the font's a lot smaller, but I can put some, what are some things that stuck out to you or you noticed? Either, again, maybe you noticed it before, or maybe it seems even more significant to you at this point. Anything that's stuck out to you, or any other new questions that came, or anything you noticed from this translation that seemed different or got your attention? Does anybody have anything? Again, we're just making observations at this point. You try. How about you? Anything come to your mind or you
Yeah,
noticed as we were reading?
the introduction in chapter 4, verse 1, between the ESV and the 1984 NIV are actually quite different in the rendering. The NIV 1984 starts by saying that the Pharisees heard that Jesus was gaining popularity and baptizing people, whereas in the ESV, it was now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard about him making and baptizing more disciples. Right? And we only have this part of Jesus learn about this in verse 3.
Yeah, so let me see if got the text comparison here. So this shows the text here. So therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard, is what we have in the NAS, but the NIV says the Pharisees heard.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
it wasn't until verse 3 in the NIV that Jesus heard. The Lord learned.
Yes. Yeah, that's interesting. Why they did that. Huh.
Well, it doesn't, I mean, if you read the whole thing, it doesn't change the meaning, but the rendering is a bit different. That's the first observation. The second one, which I can't quite figure out the significance, but notice the repetition, is about Jacob's well. In particular, when Jesus asked the Samaritan woman for water, and she actually said to Jesus that in verse 12, "Are you greater than our father Jacob?" So what I can't quite figure out is the Jacob's well, the mention of Jacob, how does it fit or what does it contribute to these bigger narratives of God seeking true worshiper?
All right, good. It's a good question. Good. Anything anyone else observed or noticed? How about you, Tungin? Anything stick out to you?
No, I mean, not really something new, but one thing in my mind, sometimes people asking me that, like, here at the end of the chapter, it says he is the savior of the world. So sometimes we say that, not often, but sometimes God have some elect. So some can that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, so what is world here? What does this mean, especially when we think about election? So it's really a theological question here that you have as you're reading. Good. One thing that stuck out to me when I read through, again, I don't know if I noticed it before, but maybe it just seemed more pronounced to me, was in the last section there, verses 35 to 38. I noticed a big repetition of reap and harvest. Several times he mentions that even food might be in there, right? Where he says, my food, do well, do 4 months, then the harvest, the fields, the harvest, the reaper harvests, reaper reaps, sows, reap. So it just sort of reaped, and even hard work, labor. So that seemed to be a big emphasis there that got my attention more in this second time that reading through it multiple times. And then as I later studied the plot in the next step, it kind of seemed to me that, yeah, there was a real emphasis here. Oh, here's another reference to food, work. Anyway, I think that scene really stuck out to me. Anything else, Pastor Philip? Anything you noticed or observed?
So, Pastor, for me, it's difficult for me to find new things here.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's okay. Sometimes, yeah, you may not have a lot that sticks out to you. And here we're not looking for, deep, insights and things. Sometimes you may get one, but we're just sort of, again, trying to force ourselves to, actively read the text. So sometimes our observations may not be, these major revolutionary thoughts or ideas. They may just be a simple observation or question.
Yeah, that living water is kind of significant. That's pulled out of Isaiah, the Old Testament, and should have got our attention. That's unique. It's a wonderful parallel and metaphor, but yeah, Jesus calls himself or is offering her living water. That is exciting, and yeah, that should stir up some interesting thoughts. Living water. We're against stale and water that's hardly living. And no doubt, I guess that there's always a lot that commentaries make about having good water. Of course, that's modern. In those days, there wasn't the contaminations we have nowadays. But living water, that's more than just stale or dirty water. This is water that gives life. And I don't know if that she picked that up, but the Lord used it, and I find that rather challenging.
Yes. Mentions it several verses. Put that down. Yeah, that might draw your attention. I think I remember Jeremiah talking about that as well as Isaiah, if I remember correctly. Good. I had just show you, when I did this, I don't know if you can see all these, and that's okay. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just as an example, these are the observations that I had come up with just in my reading through the story again several times. And, when I went back and looked at my original observations, I had a couple that, I had noticed before as well, but that's okay. That's just, again, in this new reading time, what sticks out to you. And yeah, some things may stick out or seem get your attention that got your attention before, and that's okay. Again, it's not like, okay, now that I've done the setting and the scene analysis, now I'm going to have all these new deep insights. And you might get some, but the goal here is, again, just the active reading, the familiarity with the story. And now that you've done some of the steps already, there might be additional things that do stick out to you or seem important that you hadn't noticed before. And so these are just things I did. So I had various observations, and then I focused on the translation differences. Now I didn't notice the one that you Chai mentioned. That was something, but these are other ones. Like in verse 9, NIV says, do not associate, but the New American Standard says have no dealings with. It's in verse 9. The narrator comment, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. That's a New American Standard. NIV just says they do not associate with them. So whether that's significant or not, I'm not sure. I'm just something that I noticed as a difference. Another one was verse 40, where it says in the NIV has in verse 40, get down there. NIV says the Samaritans urged him to stay, but the NAS just says they were asking him to stay. So urged seemed to be more, so it made me wonder, okay, which is it? Because urged has more the idea of, more compelling, like, please stay, you must stay. Whereas asking is just, could you stay? Would you stay with us? So the NIV seemed to have more of a passionate, plea from them to stay. So I'd want to look that word up and just see which one it is. Because urged would have more of a, right, like they really want him to stay, whereas just asking is not as passionate. But I think if it was urged, then we could see really they really wanted, they were earnest in their desire for him to be there. So that's what stuck out to me. So that's all we're doing here in this step, is just rereading the story several times and then noting anything else that pops up. Okay. All right. Well, let's get to the identifying. The next step is identifying, categorizing each character in the story. And I think this is going to prove to be an interesting exercise. All right. As we think about this and look at the story, who appears to be the protagonist? That is the main character. And this one's easy.
Jesus.
Yes. Right. Jesus is the main character, and which is the case pretty much in every story in John's gospel, right? Jesus is the main focus. So he's the protagonist. Now, here's the challenge. The antagonist. Who is or who are the antagonists in this story? And again, remember, the antagonist is someone or something that opposes the protagonist, that creates a problem for the protagonist or increases the problem, makes it worse. Anybody have any thoughts in this?
The woman.
Okay, so some might say, well, the antagonist is the woman because certainly she's a main character, right? She appears in the story more than any other character except Jesus. But is she an antagonist? Does she create a problem or cause a problem or make a problem worse for Jesus?
Yeah, I think she raised questions, another question.
Right, but is she arguing with him or is she just trying to understand him? That's a question. At the beginning, she seems like she's arguing, right? Are you greater than Jacob? But then as you go through the story, she becomes she's not that way anymore. She's not like the Pharisees, right? Who are just constantly arguing and attacking. So I don't know. What do you guys think? How do we determine the antagonist in the story? Is it the Samaritan woman?
Well,
So-
in I was just thinking, sorry, in the case of Jonah, it was very clear that Jonah was the antagonist. God asked him to go to Nineveh, and he was just creating problem, not wanting to go. But in this case, the Samaritan woman does not exactly seems to be going against what Jesus said to do. She was just asking question. You don't have how you going to draw water with, you what is it she say? You have nothing to draw the water, and so on. And then of course she got into a bit of discussion with Jesus about where is the mountain, or where is worship in terms of which mountain is supposed to take place. I don't know. I was just thinking, neither are the disciples the antagonist. I don't know. Yeah, that's a good question. It's okay not to know, right?
Well, again, see, here's where we really need to understand what is the problem in this story. That's what I think, that's significant to understand the plot, but it's also important to understand the problem.
Well, I would say, Pastor Tim, the problem is this woman basically live an immoral life, and I see beyond the 5 husbands, and the current man is not even her husband. I see beyond the so-called what was at the first level immoral life. She's been seeking for love. She's seeking satisfaction in life, and she's trying to seek for these things through human relationship. And it didn't even occur to her, or it wasn't obvious to her, that her longing can only be satisfied by God. And Jesus drew her out through a series of conversation and telling her that really your sense of being wholesome, so to speak, is having this living water. And that was why she became so accelerated. And she went around to village and said, this man has told me everything I have ever done. And Jesus didn't from the record of John, Jesus didn't tell her too many things, except that God is seeking true worshippers.
Yeah.
So I would say that is the problem, that she didn't even know that she's been looking for love. She's looking for a sense of who she is. She didn't even know that she's trying to satisfy that longing through human relationship, which only God can fulfill.
So that would make then the protagonist as the woman.
That's what I'm struggling with, and which is
Yeah.
which.
Because that certainly is a problem in the story. This woman is trying to find satisfaction in things in the world, and Jesus is going to offer her the only thing that gives true satisfaction. So certainly that's a problem in the story that becomes resolved. But is that the problem the author wants us to see as the main problem? So really want to look at, if Jesus is the main character, and I think he is clearly, what is the problem for him in this story?
Thank you. So that
Right.
then it changes the perspective, is that the problem is reaching out to the Samaritan world, to the Gentile world.
Ah, okay. Where do we see that in the story? That's an interesting observation.
Well, it probably in the beginning of the first few verses, that the Lord, in verse 4, now he had to go through Samaria. For in today's language, we say that Jesus was missional.
Okay. Anything else that would, so he had to go through Samaria. Now, does that create a problem here?
I would rather say Jesus was intentional. He didn't have to go through Samaria.
He didn't have to, that's correct. But does that create a problem in the story that seems significant to the story?
Mm.
And again, guys, this is where, we've done these steps before on the setting, and that's very important and intentional, because you got to understand the culture here. If you don't understand the culture, you won't get the main point of the story. Or the problem, anyway, in the story. What's the problem here? And the narrator hints at it a couple of times, 3 times actually, in the story.
The Jews have no dealing with Samaritans.
Yes. You guys catch that comment he makes here in verse 9?
Yeah.
And then again in verse 27.
Yeah.
The disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. Okay, so this is a narrator inserting this. And again, remember that word surprise is even could be translated amazed. Some might say even shocked.
Shocked.
So these comments inserted, okay, Jesus had to go through Samaria. Well, no, he didn't really, but he chose to. Let me reword that. He did, of course, in his plan and the Father's will, but there were other routes he could have taken. That's what I meant. But the narrator points out he had to go through. It was necessary. It was a must for him to go through Samaria. And then it makes this comment that the Samaritan woman makes a remark, and then the narrator tells us, okay, this is why that her remark, why she said this. And then later, what's the problem here? I think it is Jesus' interaction with this Samaritan woman. That the antagonist here is really the culture, the attitude of the culture, the prejudice of the culture. That's what's causing a problem here. Right? And that's why in verse 27, the disciples are surprised or shocked even to find him talking with this woman, but they didn't say anything about it to him. So as you go through the story, you want to think about, I think it is the antagonist, in my opinion, is this cultural prejudice, especially from the Jewish perspective towards Samaritans, that is opposing this story, opposing Jesus, really. Now, the Pharisees don't show up and attack him, but that cultural background is really blankets this story, in my view. And you see these comments by the narrator, I think he's pushing us that direction. Like, this is a problem here. Jesus talking to this woman. This is an issue. She's a Samaritan. She's immoral. She's a woman. Jews don't have dealings with Samaritans. And then the disciples see that, he's talking to this woman. What's he doing? But they don't say anything. So you have this, I think, coming over the top of this story, this understanding of the culture. If we lived in that day and we start, if we didn't know the story, right? We're reading John's gospel. We're Jews, okay? We're reading his gospel. Okay, Jesus had to pass through Samaria. What's he going there for? Those Samaritans are pagan. They're false worshipers. We don't even go there. We shake the dust off our feet. We avoid that land. What's he doing? And then he starts talking with a woman. And then the narrator throws in, Jews don't associate with Samaritans. And then he has this whole conversation with her. What's this story about, right? It's the Samaritans believing in Christ. But that's a problem in that culture. Jesus being there with them, interacting with them, and even reaching out to them. I think that's the problem in the story. The Samaritan woman doesn't, she's not the problem, though she's a part of it because she's a Samaritan woman. So that creates a problem, but it's not her doing. She just come into the well to get some water. Jesus really engages her.
Yep.
So I don't think it's the disciples, because yes, they are surprised at what he's doing, but they don't push against it, do they? They don't say, Jesus, get out of here. Don't talk to her. They notice it, but they don't say a word. The Samaritans, are they causing a problem in the story? No, they appear to be receiving the benefits of the situation. So you got to think through, all right, does the Samaritan woman, does she cause or create or worsen the problem? In a sense, she does, because Jesus is interacting with her, but is she the one causing that problem, or is it the cultural prejudice of the Jews that creates the that makes the problem here? You see what I'm saying? What do you guys think?
No, this is really insightful, Pastor Tim, because so in this case, the antagonist is not a character or a person, but the prevailing culture or if I may say, ethnic prejudices in their time. And that was really the problem of why the Jews are not reaching out to the Gentiles or to the Samaritan, which is actually what was God's promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. And because of the cultural and the ethnic prejudices, and that is really the antagonist, not in the person or in a character, but in that prevailing culture. And I was thinking, as you were saying, Pastor Tim, that isn't this very much what some of us are experiencing? And Dwayne will be probably able to relate how in Malaysia there is this prevailing problem that the Muslims will look at us with a certain resistance as a culture, not necessarily the individual person, but the prevailing religious culture that are basically very much against Christianity.
Yes. Yeah, I think definitely some parallels there.
I was thinking that you know, when the narrator says that in verse 4, now he had to go through Samaria, it sort of create a mysterious idea that, you know, why must Jesus go through? I mean, knowing, I mean, if you were to read down until verse 9, when it says that Jews do not associate with the Samaritans, I mean, what was Jesus trying to do? Was you see, because he wants to take a shortcut, you know, well, come what may, I'm going to go through Samaria, no? So
Yeah.
what? Or I'm tired. I think there's a well there. We need some water, you know, or whatever it is. Or I can't go any further now. You guys, you know, telling his disciples, you go and get food for me, or whatever it is. Or they themselves says, you know, we need to eat. Until we come to the point where then he engaged with the Samaritan woman. Now we know why he had to go through Samaria. So it was an intentional thing, as you pointed out. He had to go through not because of all those reasons which I just mentioned earlier on, but because he wanted to meet the Samaritan woman and to speak to her and to tell her that, you know, I'm the one who can give you living water. So I'm not seeing her as an antagonist, nor the culture per se, in a sense. It could be part of it, a sub-antagonist, if I may use the word. I would say that the other sub-antagonists would be the disciples. Because if you were to look down at, you know, when the disciples came back after buying lunch, John spent, I mean, it's quite a long verse, verse 27. saying that when the disciples returned, they were surprised or they were shocked to see him talking with the woman. And of course, in their minds already, so John was perhaps was trying to read their minds, or maybe he himself was thinking the same thing. No one asked, what do you, I mean, what are you trying to do, Master? I mean, what do you want? Why are you talking with her? So you shouldn't be doing that, perhaps in their mind, their heart saying, well, you shouldn't be doing that. You're a Jew, like us. So perhaps that they could have been the antagonists at that point of time as well. I don't know. That's what I'm trying to read. Otherwise, why does John have to include this portion? I mean, he could have just said, when they returned, they saw him talking to the Samaritan woman, and then go on to verse 28 and so on, which was also rather very jarring intervention there, in the sense that John suddenly just mentioned, then leaving a water jar, the woman went back to the town. There was no continuity there. I mean, if you were to produce a film, you're wondering where is that continuity from verse 27 into verse 28. So obviously all these were intentional, making us think that, I'm going there, I'm going to speak to this woman. My disciples come, let them think what they want to say. And this woman, having heard me, she's going back to the town to share what she knows about me.
Yeah, and I think I had that question as well. And I think what helped me, or at least what convinced me that the disciples were not the antagonists, is that they only reflect the problem. They don't cause or increase it. Because if verse 27 continued and it said, the disciples said, what are you talking? If they had said, Jesus stopped talking to her, or let's leave, or they don't say anything. John just reveals their thoughts, or
his own thoughts, perhaps.
What they didn't ask. So I think they just reflect the problem. They're not causing or increasing the problem, in my view, because they don't respond or do anything. They just, they're shocked and they have, these thoughts, but no one says anything. They just say, hey, Rabbi, eat something. They don't even tell the woman to go away, at least, not in the account. So I don't think they're causing or worsening the problem. I think they reflect it. They have that same mindset, because then we have to ask ourselves, and this is really significant to the story, if the focus is the conversion of this woman, why do we have verses 31 to 38? This is I think, an important question to consider in the story. If it really is about the conversion of the Samaritans, that Jesus is going to reach out to the Gentiles, and God brings salvation to the Gentiles, which is a key element in the story. But is that the message that John's wanting us to grab? Is it simply just Jesus sharing the gospel with the Samaritans, or is there something else going on here? And this is why it comes back to, okay, well, what is the problem in this story? It is that Jesus is sharing the gospel with the Samaritans, because the culture would not have this Jewish holy man interact at all with Samaritans, let alone a Samaritan woman, let alone an immoral Samaritan woman. I think this is the big problem here. And this would be the shock to a Jewish reader. Like if they didn't know the story, as it unfolds, they're like going, what is he doing? They would have the same shock that the disciples did. All right. Why? Because they, in that time anyway, many of the Jews had this mentality, anti-Samaritan mentality. And so again, we think, okay, John's including this story about when Jesus went to the Samaritans. No other gospel had this account. John does. And he opens it with, he had to go to Samaria. And then we see the interaction with the woman, but the story doesn't only involve the woman. because then there's this whole interaction with the disciples as well. So this story presents a great challenge in trying to understand, all right, well, what is the problem here? Who is the antagonist? I think it is the cultural attitude towards the cultural perception or attitude of Jews and Samaritans, and that this attitude is a hindrance to, could be a hindrance to the gospel. Of course, not for Jesus. But if you think about it, and I think, let me keep going with this, and I think maybe it might be more helpful to think about, okay, if the antagonist is primarily the cultural prejudice, let's run with that a minute. If we say the antagonist is the cultural prejudice, particularly of the Jews towards Samaritans, that this is the problem that is reflected by the disciples. Okay, but I don't think they push it or cause it here. And in the statements in verses 4, 9, and 27. If that's the case, let's step back then and think a minute. All right, what then, who would the foils be in this story? And again, thinking of a, yeah, go ahead, Dwayne.
Yeah, it's very obvious she had no intentions of giving him water. He never got a drink of water. And Jesus kept firing these questions at her, and she never even heard living water. That's, of course, just something that we would probably notice. But boy, he just shoots one question until it's about her husband. And then that blows that out of the water when he tells her all about her. And he got her attention, and he got her to see what he wanted her to see. She got a sin problem, and she tried to get religious yet on him and tried to run off on that, but he didn't let her go. He brought her right back. And he did a masterful job of bringing the problem to her attention. And he had to chase her all over to get her to, admit she had a problem. And this is a classic, I guess, way we should approach people, as far as, it's just amazing she didn't pick up stones and start throwing at him. But she had some idea he was special, and he let her know he was special. And so I think she probably was anticipating rejecting him and maybe doing something a little violent. But the Lord didn't give her any room for that. It's just amazing approach to get her attention to see what he wanted her to see. And she never heard the living water, and water wasn't involved here. It was her wretched life. She was really bad. Oh man. And he was really good. And we've got to present Christ. He's really good and we're really bad. And boy, it's a classic. You just can't get a better example of how to deal with sinners and get them to see the problem. They know the problem, but to get them to deal with it.
Oh yeah, there's, clearly on Jesus's part. I mean, he was focused and made every effort to reach this woman, right? To get her, address her where she needed to be addressed. So
yeah, he didn't let her get away with anything. She wanted to talk about the mountain. He didn't let that happen. He always brought her back to the problem, and it was her wretchedness. And of course, all at once, that living water, I think, maybe had some influence.
Yeah, so I think there's a clear focus here in the, in the text, the story. Jesus wanted to bring, reveal himself to these Samaritans. that's clearly, you know, I think when we think about he had to go to Samaria, we can see why as we go through the story. It's like he wanted to reveal himself to them, right? But there is a problem that would seek to thwart or hinder that, right? And that problem is the cultural prejudice. Even the woman brings it up, you know, why are you asking me for water? Jews don't associate. So she could have shut down the whole conversation right there, right? Like, we're not supposed to be talking to each other. But Jesus keeps going. And then the disciples show up and they're like, what? What's he doing? Right now, they don't say anything, but they reveal or reflect the cultural prejudice that Jesus was dealing with in talking to these Samaritans, because it goes not just from the woman, it expands to the whole village at the end of the story. So I think, what is it that's opposing the main character? What is it that's creating a problem or hindrance for the main character? I think in this story, we can't look at the other characters as doing that. They're simply reflecting the culture that was the problem. All right. Now, if the Samaritan woman had stood up and said, look, you can't be talking to me, get out of here, I don't want to hear it, you know, and she runs off or whatever, you know, maybe she would be seen more as the problem. But I think, as Dwayne mentioned, right, she's asking these questions. Maybe she's trying to get out of it, but she stays and she talks with him and she ends up believing it. So, you know, I could see a case made that she's like the antagonist in some ways, but honestly, I don't think she's the primary one causing the problem, nor the disciples. I think they just reflect the problem that really opposes Jesus, in my view. And so I would see the foils in the story really as the disciples, in contrast to Christ, right? Christ is reaching out to the Samaritans. The disciples, right, they simply have the prejudice of the culture. You know, they don't seem to have said anything in the Samaritan village. They just went and got food and came back. Jesus here is sharing, you know, revealing himself to the woman. The disciples should have been doing that. They should have been telling the people in the village, hey, the Messiah is here. Do you want to come see him? But they don't appear to have done that. And so we, you know, of course, the lesson that Jesus gives them in the scene he has with them. And then
John in chapter 6 says, unless the Father draws you, you can't come. And it's very obvious God the Father was drawing her in. And of course, Jesus knows this. He sees it a lot better. I'm dealing with a homosexual right now, and God is drawing him too. It's pathetic. I have had a real education as to the undercurrents. This guy is really bad. He was in Singapore, and it's just really bad. And but the Lord is doing something. It's like this woman, you know, the Lord was doing something. She didn't run off or throw rocks at him. You know, she was searching. It's obvious we knew that she had problems, and she was searching. And this guy that I'm dealing with, he's searching, and I'm thrilled to be able to, I guess, respond to him and teach him English in the meantime, and he's paying for it, you know. And it's going to be interesting to see where this goes with this guy. We're halfway through the course now, and he keeps coming. He was supposed to go and have a Bible session with his nun. He's a Roman Catholic, and he's really high on the Virgin. And he's been sending me stuff about the Virgin. He gave me a little book, The Road Home to Rome. Home Sweet Rome. That's the name of the book. Rome Sweet Home. Oh, it is pathetic. But, but he keeps coming back, and I just tell him about Jesus, you know, and tell him, you know, about what I know is the truth about things. And he gets very sober because he's very lonely. It's not working. And well, it's just the bottom line is God, the Father, is doing something. And we need to watch for that, because not always does God the Father do something. But in this case, with this woman, he obviously was. And I've got a strong inclination with this homosexual, and he just loves the LGBTQ or whatever all that is. He wants to share with that be all the time, and well, that's nice if that's what he wants, but I'm not interested. And then I get real interested in English real fast when he comes on with all that stuff. But I tell you, Lord Jesus does a masterful job of bringing this woman around. And boy, what a harvest, huh? What a harvest.
That's
and
really
dumb disciples, all they do is chewing on their sandwiches, and they're just brain dead. It's just hilarious to watch the disciples.
I think your example there, Dwayne, really is in some ways pretty close to what's going on here. There's a prejudice or bias in the churches against homosexuals, right? That, don't interact, don't talk to those guys. They're wretched sinners, right? And
it's strange.
I think there's a lot of parallels here to that. So there are some cultural prejudices, at least in some places in the world, against homosexuality. So people won't even talk to them. It's like, well, wait a minute. They're the mission field, right? So, I think we can understand a little bit of the attitude of the Jewish culture with that sort of a parallel. And that, so the fact that, I remember reaching out, talking with a homosexual guy, reaching out to him, and somebody was, cautioning me about doing that. I'm like, what? Aren't we here to reach out to these very people who are in sin and who need the living water? And so I think the problem Jesus faced, it is in our churches today as well. Different elements of the culture which a prejudice would oppose bringing the gospel to them. So I think that's a really good parallel, Dwayne, to what's going on here. And you're right, it is the Lord who draws, and clearly the Lord was, very active in the hearts of these Samaritans in this particular story. And so, I think if you look at it in the terms of, if you would see it, the problem in terms of the cultural prejudice, and that it's the culture really is the antagonist here, then the disciples in a lot of ways serve as a foil, in that they are a contrast to Christ, in my view, in this particular story, that they're questioning why Jesus is talking with the woman. Why are they doing that? Why are they shocked? Because they are following the prejudice of their culture. And so Jesus has to basically, I don't know if we would say scold them, but definitely bring to their attention that they're missing the point here. And so I think the disciples I would see as sort of a foil. And then the Samaritans, I think, are also a foil, because they contrast the prejudice of the culture, the antagonist, because they asked Jesus to stay there. Even though he's a Jew, a Jewish holy man. And certainly the Samaritans had their own prejudices against the Jews. But they say, Jesus, can you stay here? We want, and that's where I think the urge would be an important word to understand, or like, Jesus, we want you to stay with us. Don't leave. So in a way, I think the Samaritans really contrast the problem of the cultural prejudice. The disciples fall into that problem, so they contrast Christ. And I think the Samaritans contrast the culture, in that they want this Jewish man to stay with them. So that's sort of how I'm seeing the story unfolding here. And then the question comes back to, okay, well, what about the Samaritan woman? What role does she play? She doesn't seem to be the protagonist. I think that's Christ. I don't think she's the antagonist, though I think she just falls into the same prejudices of the culture initially, but then the rest of the story, as Dwayne pointed out, is not really about that at all. It's about her recognizing her sin and her need for help with that. So I don't think she's opposed to Christ. The culture is opposed to Jesus having this talk with her, but I don't think she is. So in a sense, she's almost like another main character in this story. So I want to, next time we gather, I want to talk about that. So I just want to leave you with that thought. Think about, how does the Samaritan woman fit into the story? She's clearly a main character next to Christ. That's obvious. The story really focuses on her. But is she a foil? Is she
No.
sort of another protagonist? Is she an antagonist? Again, I don't think she's an antagonist. As you look at the story, she doesn't continue to create or cause the problem, does she? Normally in a story, the antagonist just continues to increase or worsen the problem or maintain the problem. In this story, the Samaritan woman doesn't do that. But yet she's more important than just some side character, obviously. So is she a foil here? Does she serve as a comparison or contrast to something? Or is she perhaps one of those stories where she's almost like a main character herself, protagonist? So those are some of the options to consider. I don't want to answer it now since it's getting close to our end time, but we can pick it up at this point next week. Really think about, and if you're thinking, okay, why all the detail? Isn't this just sort of, theoretical, academic, story analysis? Clearly the story here is Jesus sharing himself with these Samaritans. Well, but we want to get at what is the message of the author here? What does he seem to be drawing our attention to? What does he want the reader to draw out of this particular story? Why is John included here? And it really, in my view, I think that whole conversation with the disciples really is key to understanding what John wants us to see in the story. All right. It's not just about the conversion of the Samaritans. There's a message here in that I think John wants to draw out. So by looking at these details and who's the antagonist, who's the protagonist, who are the foils, this isn't just an academic exercise in storytelling. It's really trying to get at what is the heart of John's message here. And to be able to do that, you have to identify who these characters are, what their role is in the story. All right. So next time we gather, we'll talk about the Samaritan woman as far as her role in the story, and then get into, okay, what are the key statements and actions from each of these main characters within the story, and the narrator as well. We've already talked a little about the narrator and some significant remarks that he makes, but we'll dive more into that next time. But I think now would be probably a good time to end our study for tonight, unless there's any final questions or comments or insights that you guys have before we go.
Pastor Tim, can I just pick up a comment that Dwayne actually mentioned in passing, or sort of, was quite interesting. Not so much of the plot analysis or what we are trying to get the author intent, but Dwayne in passing was saying, I think he said something like sinners acting religious.
Yeah.
And I was just reading through John 4 again, and how when Jesus said to the Samaritan woman, if you know of this water I'm giving you, will spring from within him, welling up, become an eternal life. And she asked Jesus, give me this water so that I won't be thirsty. I don't have to come back here to draw water again. Jesus did not immediately give her the answer, but say to her, go and call your husband.
Yeah.
And that pinpoint her sinful lifestyle, or her immoral lifestyle, and then she turned religious. She, and she went on and said, "Sir, I can see that you are a prophet, but she said, the Jews claim that this is a place we should worship in Jerusalem," and then she started talking religious. And how Dwayne just now, in passing, he mentioned, I think, Dwayne, you mentioned something like sinners acting religious. And I was thinking to myself, this is more for pastoral, you know, as we talk to people on ourselves, how true it is that we try to project a facade of religiosity and spirituality to hide our sinfulness.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. That's why the hardest people, in my opinion, the hardest people to reach for the gospel are churchgoers who aren't saved. And we've got a lot of them here in the United States that are, they're cultural Christians that, you know, they show up at church, they sing, they, you know, listen to sermons, they do all that stuff, but they're not saved. They're the hardest to reach because, you know, they'll throw up all barriers and, you know, religiosity and, but they won't deal with their sin problem. So I don't know what you guys think, but that I found them to be the hardest people that are regular church attenders that, you know, say they're Christians, but aren't.
Yeah, I think that's true. I can't remember who said it, but either I heard it or I read it, that it's called the okay church. Okay, I'm okay, he is okay, she is okay, we are all okay. It's the okay church. What's your problem? What are you talking about sin and God's holiness?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, well, unless the Lord opens the heart and the eyes and the ears, it's pretty frustrating. And you know, this woman, God was working in this woman. There's no question, and yeah, that's what we look for. And then when we see it, we sig them. We sig them right away when we see something happening. And you know, it's we may not see the harvest, but boy, we can be part of it. And I'm just tickled pink to be part of something that God is doing.
Yes.
And what bothers me is he doesn't draw everybody. I wish he did. There's some people he just lets go. You know, it's just nothing happening. But again, you tell them too if you have an opportunity. You don't, I guess, look behind your ear and see if God is doing something. You just go ahead and take for granted he is. But boy, when he really is, then it's exciting. See it.
And you never know, because sometimes a person's response, you know, is pushing back, but God uses it, works on them, and later, I remember the guy in college I was sharing the gospel with a number of times. He was one of these guys we were just talking about that, you know, knows all the facts, but he wasn't saved. So his, you know, he sort of used his religion to, so I kept sharing with him, you know, he kept showing up, but never seemed to respond. And then one day, you know, I don't know how many months later, he comes up to me and he says, Tim, I'm a Christian now. I believe, you know, and so I asked him a few questions and he's like, yeah, this guy actually got saved. And I'm thinking, how did this happen? Because he never showed any interest when I was talking to him. He'd always just sort of, you know, deflect and all this. And it was some guy that he met while he was sitting on a bench reading, and some guy walked up to him and just started sharing the gospel with him. And, you know, I'd shared the gospel with him many, many times. He never responded. Well, this guy, he did respond. So, but he had been thinking about a lot of our conversations we had had, and then just the Lord and his timing used that guy to you know, God opened his eyes at that moment. It was just kind of interesting, though. You know, all the discussions we had, there never seemed to be any response, and yet God was at work, even though I couldn't see it. So, like you said, Dwayne, you never know. You just got to be faithful to reach out, and the Lord will, you know, will call who he calls, but we need to be involved in the process. And I think that's the lesson for the disciples here in this story, isn't it?
Yep.
Don't sit on the sidelines, guys. You're supposed to be doing this.
Amen.
So So let's dive more into that next time we go. I just really wanted to provoke your thoughts about what's going on in this story and really think carefully about each of the characters and how they contribute, because understanding their role is going to help us understand the plot, which will help us understand the point of the story. And anyway, okay, thanks for your input, guys. I want to respect your time that you need to go to bed. I know it's late for some of you there, so I want to respect that, but thank you. Hopefully this was helpful, and Lord willing, we'll gather again together next week, and we'll pick up with the Samaritan woman, talk more about her and then the characters' actions and statements in the story. All right, but try to give it some thought this week. Read through the story again, kind of see how might the Samaritan woman fit into this particular story as far as characters go and their roles. Okay. All right. Pastor Philip, could you close us in prayer?